Hi, and welcome to the Archive of History. Close your eyes for just a moment, and imagine this: you are standing at the edge of an endless jungle, where the morning mist clings to the canopy like a veil of silver gauze. The air is thick with moisture, and the smell of damp earth, rotting leaves, and something else, something ancient and unknowable. Somewhere deep in that green darkness, beyond mountains that scrape the clouds and rivers that wind like serpents through valleys no European has ever seen, there lies a city of gold. Its temples gleam in the sunlight, its streets are paved with precious metal, its people adorn themselves with treasures that would ransom kingdoms. This is El Dorado, the Golden One, the dream that drove men mad, that toppled empires, that sent thousands to their deaths in the most hostile terrain on earth. Tonight we journey into the heart of that dream. We will walk alongside conquistadors who traded everything for the promise of gold. We will stand in the courts of kings who gambled their fortunes on rumors whispered by dying men. We will witness the birth of the greatest treasure hunt in history, and we will follow it to its bitter, inevitable end. Before we drift off, I am always curious to know where my listeners are tuning in from and what time it is that they are listening tonight. Let me know in the comments. And now let the noise of the modern world fade away. Let the glow of screens dim to darkness. Settle yourself into the comfort of your bed, and let us travel back to a time when the map of the world was still unfinished, when entire continents were blank spaces waiting to be filled with either truth or legend. Let us go in search of the city of gold. The story of El Dorado does not begin with a city. It begins with a man. It begins in the year 1534. On the shores of a mountain lake so high in the Andes that the air itself feels thin and strange, where every breath must be earned. This is Lake Guatavita, a perfectly circular body of water nestled in the peaks of what is now Colombia, sacred to the Muisca people who have lived in these highlands for centuries. You are standing on the shore in the cool darkness before dawn, surrounded by thousands of silent figures. The surface of the lake is perfectly still, a mirror of black glass reflecting the stars. No one speaks. The only sound is the whisper of wind through the reeds and the occasional crackle of torches held aloft by priests in elaborate robes. You are here to witness a ceremony that happens only once in a generation, when a new ruler takes his place, when a new chieftain is chosen to lead his people. This is not a coronation in any sense you would recognize. There is no crown, no scepter, no throne. There is only gold and water and faith. As the first pale light touches the eastern mountains, a raft appears at the water's edge. It has been constructed over many days from bundled reeds, lashed together with plant fiber, large enough to carry a dozen men. At its center stands a platform, and upon that platform, naked and shivering in the cold mountain air, stands the man who will be chieftain. His body has been covered in a sticky resin, and now as you watch, priests approach with bowls filled with gold dust. They blow it onto his skin through hollow reeds, and the dust clings to the resin, transforming him inch by inch into a figure of gleaming metal. His arms, his chest, his face, all become gold. He does not move. He barely seems to breathe. The torchlight flickers across his transformed body, and for a moment he does not look like a man at all. He looks like a statue, like something divine. The raft is pushed out onto the water. The golden man stands at its center, surrounded by priests and attendants carrying offerings, more gold, emeralds that catch the dawn light like fragments of green fire, pottery filled with sacred herbs. The crowd on the shore begins to chant, a low rhythmic sound that seems to rise from the earth itself. The raft glides slowly toward the center of the lake, leaving a gentle wake that disturbs the mirror surface. When it reaches the deepest part, the chanting stops, silence falls like a curtain. And then, with slow, deliberate movements, the attendants begin to throw the offerings into the water. You hear the splash of gold striking the surface, see the brief flash of emeralds tumbling through the air. Piece by piece, the accumulated wealth of the people is given to the lake, returned to the earth, offered to the gods who dwell in the depths. And then the golden man himself, his body still covered in precious dust, steps to the edge of the raft and dives. He disappears beneath the black water, and the gold upon his skin washes away, sinking down into the depths to join the other offerings. He has given everything. He has been transformed and then cleansed. When he surfaces and swims back to the raft, he is just a man again. But he is a man reborn, a man chosen. This is the ceremony of El Dorado. This is the Golden One. It is real. It happens. It has been happening for longer than anyone can remember, long before the first Spanish ships appeared on the horizon, long before the word conquistador was ever spoken in these mountains. But the Spanish, when they finally hear tell of this ceremony, will not understand it as you do now. They will hear the words man covered in gold and lake filled with treasure, and their minds will transform those words into something else entirely. They will imagine not a single ritual, not a religious ceremony, but an entire kingdom. They will imagine a city where gold is as common as stone, where the very buildings shine in the sun, where treasure beyond all counting waits to be claimed. The golden man will become the golden city, and the golden city will become an obsession that will last for 300 years. You must understand the world the Spanish conquistadors came from to understand why they believed so completely, so desperately in El Dorado. They arrived in the New World in the wake of extraordinary success. In 1519, Hernán Cortés had conquered the mighty Aztec Empire with a few hundred men, discovering the golden city of Tenochtitlan built on a lake, its temples glittering with treasure. Just over a decade later, Francisco Pizarro had toppled the Inca Empire, the largest and most sophisticated civilization in South America, and claimed the golden treasures of Cusco. These were not legends. These were facts. Cities of gold had been found. Empires rich beyond imagination had fallen. If it had happened twice, why not a third time? Why not a fourth? The Spanish crown was hungry. The wars in Europe were expensive. The maintenance of empire demanded gold, and lots of it. Every ship that returned from the Indies laden with treasure proved that there was more to be found, more to be taken. And so, when rumors began to circulate, whispers passed from indigenous people to interpreters to conquistadors to officials, and finally to the king himself. These rumors were taken seriously. Men were commissioned, expeditions were funded, permissions were granted. Gold, the crown said, find El Dorado, bring back the gold. The first whispers came from many directions at once, like threads of a web drawing together. Some came from indigenous people who had been captured, enslaved, or simply questioned by the Spanish. They spoke of rich kingdoms in the interior, of chiefs who wore gold, of cities hidden in the mountains or deep in the jungle. Some of these stories were true, or at least based on truth. The Muisca Confederation did exist. They did work gold with extraordinary skill. They did perform ceremonies involving vast amounts of precious metal. But other stories were fabrications, either intentional lies told by people desperate to send their captors away, or misunderstandings born from the chaos of translation, where a word in one language became something entirely different in another. Other whispers came from the conquistadors themselves, from men who had seen just enough to fuel their imagination. They had glimpsed gold ornaments worn by indigenous chiefs. They had seen golden figurines in temples. They had heard, through interpreters, about places further inland where gold was more plentiful. Each small piece of evidence became magnified, transformed, mythologized. A golden ornament became a golden palace. A rich chief became a golden kingdom. A distant place became a golden city waiting to be discovered. And still other whispers came from desperation and greed. The New World was filling up with conquistadors, minor nobles, soldiers of fortune, men who had crossed the ocean hoping to make their fortunes, but who had found that all the easy pickings were gone. The great Aztec and Inca treasures had been claimed by others. The first wave of conquest had made some men fabulously wealthy, but it had left many more with nothing. These men needed to believe in El Dorado. They needed to believe that there was still a golden city out there, waiting for them, a city that would make them rich beyond their wildest dreams. And so they listened to every rumor, followed every lead, convinced themselves that the next expedition, the next journey into the unknown, would be the one that succeeded. By the late 1530s, the legend of El Dorado had crystallized into something specific. It was no longer just a ceremony or a chief. It was a place. It was a city. Perhaps an entire kingdom, somewhere in the vast unexplored interior of South America. Some said it was in the mountains. Others said it was in the jungle. Some placed it near great rivers. Others near vast lakes. The details shifted and changed, depending on who was telling the story, but the core remained the same. There was a city of gold, and it was waiting to be found. The jungle that guarded these secrets was unlike anything the Spanish had ever encountered. It was not the open battlefields of Europe, where men fought in orderly lines and victories were measured in territory gained. It was not even like the high plateaus of Mexico or Peru, where at least the terrain was comprehensible. The jungle was a living thing, hostile and impassable. Trees grew so tall and so thick that sunlight barely reached the forest floor. Vines hung like ropes, tangling around legs and arms. The undergrowth was so dense that a man with a machete might advance only a few hundred yards in an entire day of brutal labor. The air was suffocating, thick with humidity, and the smell of decay. Insects swarmed in clouds, biting exposed skin, crawling into clothing, into food, into wounds. Diseases unknown in Europe waited in the water, in the insects, in the very air itself. Yellow fever, malaria, dysentery. These killed more men than any hostile tribe, more men than starvation or thirst or drowning. And yet, despite all of this, men went. They organized expeditions of hundreds, sometimes thousands of soldiers, indigenous bearers, African slaves, horses, dogs, pigs for food. They marched into the green hell with full confidence that they would emerge victorious, laden with gold. They believed, because they had to believe. They had staked everything on this dream, their money, their reputations, their lives. To turn back without finding El Dorado was unthinkable. And so they pressed on, even as their numbers dwindled, even as the jungle consumed them one by one. The first major expedition in search of El Dorado was led by Gonzalo Pizarro, brother of the conqueror of Peru. In 1541, he set out from Quito with a force of over 200 Spanish soldiers and 4,000 indigenous people pressed into service as bearers. His goal was to find a land called the Land of Cinnamon, which he had heard lay to the east, and beyond that, he was certain, lay El Dorado itself. The expedition was a disaster from the very beginning. The Land of Cinnamon turned out to be a disappointment. There were cinnamon trees, yes, but not in the quantities that would make exploitation profitable. More importantly, the terrain was impossibly difficult. The expedition found itself descending from the high Andes into the Amazon basin, into a world of rivers and swamps and endless rain. Within months, half the indigenous bearers were dead, killed by disease, starvation, or simply worked to death. The horses began to die as well, unable to find proper forage in the jungle. The men ate them. Then they ate the dogs. Then they ate whatever they could find. Roots, insects, leather from their own equipment, boiled until it was soft enough to chew. Pizarro pushed on, driven by the certainty that El Dorado was just ahead, just a little further, just beyond the next river. It was at this point that Francisco de Orellana enters our story. He was Pizarro's lieutenant, and when it became clear that the expedition was running out of food, Pizarro made a fateful decision. He ordered Orellana to take a small party of men, along with the expedition's single boat, and travel downriver in search of food. The plan was for Orellana to find supplies and return within 2 weeks. Orellana agreed and set off with about 50 men, rowing and drifting down a river that grew wider and wider with each passing day. But Orellana never returned. The current was too strong. The river carried him east, always east, deeper and deeper into the jungle. He tried to turn back, but it was impossible. The current was relentless, so he made the only choice available to him. He would follow the river all the way to the sea. What followed was one of the most extraordinary journeys of exploration in history. Orellana and his men spent months drifting down the river, fighting off attacks from indigenous tribes, building new boats when the old ones fell apart, surviving on whatever fish or game they could catch. They saw things no European had ever seen: massive river dolphins, pink and gray, surfacing in the murky water. Villages built on stilts above the floodplains. Warrior women who fought alongside the men, which led Orellana to name the river after the Amazons of Greek legend. The river that carried him, we know now, was the Amazon itself, the greatest river in the world. Orellana had crossed the entire continent, emerging finally at the Atlantic coast, half-starved and barely alive, but alive nonetheless. When Orellana eventually made his way back to Spain and told his story, he did not speak of finding El Dorado, but he spoke of rich kingdoms along the river, of cities glimpsed from a distance, of gold and silver and precious stones. His words added fuel to the fire. If there were rich kingdoms on the Amazon, then surely somewhere in that vast green expanse, El Dorado must exist. Meanwhile, Pizarro and the remnants of his expedition, abandoned by Orellana and slowly starving, eventually turned back toward Quito. Of the more than 4,000 people who had set out, Fewer than 80 Spaniards and a handful of indigenous survivors returned. Pizarro had lost everything. His fortune, his reputation, most of his men. He had found nothing but suffering. But the dream of El Dorado did not die with his failure. If anything, it grew stronger. Now let us turn back in time slightly, to the year 1536, and to another expedition that would become entangled with the legend. Gonzalo Jiménez de Quesada was a Spanish lawyer and conquistador who led an expedition up the Magdalena River in what is now Colombia. His goal was not specifically to find El Dorado, at least not at first. He was searching for a route to the interior, hoping to find rich kingdoms to conquer. What he found exceeded his expectations. After months of brutal travel through swamps and jungles, suffering losses similar to Pizarro's expedition, Quesada and his men finally ascended into the high plateaus of the Andes and discovered the Muisca Confederation. The Muisca were not a single empire, but a loose confederation of chiefdoms spread across the highlands. They were farmers and gold workers, skilled artisans who created beautiful objects from gold and emeralds mined in their territory. They were not warriors in the same sense as the Aztecs or Incas. They had no standing armies, no fortified cities. When Quesada arrived with his disciplined soldiers and their steel weapons, the Muisca stood little chance. Within 2 years, Quesada had conquered the Confederation, claimed its territory for Spain, and founded the city that would become Bogotá. And the gold. There was gold. Quesada and his men collected enormous quantities of it. Ornaments, figurines, funeral offerings plundered from tombs. They melted it down and divided it according to the strict rules of Spanish conquest, with the crown receiving its fifth, the leaders receiving shares proportional to their rank, and the common soldiers receiving whatever remained. It was a fortune, enough to make Quesada a wealthy man. But it was not El Dorado. It was not a city of gold. It was simply a confederation of people who worked gold beautifully and who had the misfortune of living in a land the Spanish desired. Yet Quesada's conquest had an enormous impact on the legend of El Dorado. When he interrogated Muisca chiefs and priests through interpreters, they told him about the ceremony at Lake Guatavita. They described the golden man, the offerings thrown into the lake, the mountains of treasure that had accumulated over generations in the depths. Quesada was fascinated. He organized an expedition to drain the lake, to recover the treasure from its bottom. The attempt was only partially successful. Some gold and emeralds were indeed recovered, but the lake was too deep, its waters too cold and dark for a complete excavation with the primitive tools available. More importantly, the stories Quesada heard from the Muisca began to merge with other rumors and legends circulating among the Spanish. The ceremony of the Golden Man became conflated with stories of golden cities in the jungle. The Muisca Confederation became proof that rich kingdoms existed in the interior. And somewhere the logic went, there must be an even richer kingdom, a place where gold was so abundant that entire cities were built from it. Quesada had found something extraordinary, but to the Spanish mind, it was merely a preview of something greater yet to be found. The impact of these early expeditions cannot be overstated. Pizarro had proven that the jungle could be penetrated, even if the cost was horrific. Orellana had crossed the entire continent and returned to tell the tale. Quesada had found a rich civilization in the mountains and claimed it for Spain. Each success, no matter how pyrrhic, suggested that more was possible. Each discovery fed the dream. The map of South America was gradually being filled in, but vast blank spaces remained, and in those blank spaces men drew golden cities with their imaginations. By the 1550s, the legend of El Dorado had taken on a life of its own. It was discussed in the courts of Spain, debated in taverns in Seville, whispered about in the ports of the Caribbean. Maps were drawn showing its possible location, though the placement varied wildly. Some put it in the mountains of Colombia, near where Quesada had found the Muisca. Others placed it in the Amazon basin, in the vast unmapped territory that Orellana had traversed. Still others believed it lay in the highlands of Venezuela or in the mysterious lands beyond the Orinoco River. The uncertainty only added to the allure. El Dorado could be anywhere, which meant it could be everywhere. Every expedition that returned without finding it simply meant they had looked in the wrong place. It was in this atmosphere of obsession and desperation that one of the darkest chapters in the search for El Dorado began. The year was 1560, and the expedition was led by a Spanish nobleman named Pedro de Ursua. He had been commissioned by the Viceroy of Peru to explore the Amazon and to search for El Dorado, which by this time was being called by various names. Some referred to it as the Kingdom of the Omaguas, others as the Land of Meta, still others simply as the Golden City. Ursua assembled a force of about 300 Spanish soldiers, along with hundreds of indigenous people and African slaves to serve as porters, boatmen, and laborers. The expedition traveled by river, building and manning a fleet of crude boats and rafts. Among the soldiers was a man named Lope de Aguirre. He was in his 50s, old by the standards of conquistadors, a man who had spent decades in the New World without ever making his fortune. He was bitter, resentful, and quite possibly insane. He walked with a limp from an old wound, and his eyes held a look that made other men uncomfortable. He was not a leader, at least not at the beginning. He was simply another soldier, hoping that this expedition would finally bring him the wealth he believed he was owed. The expedition began badly, and grew worse. Ursua was not a strong leader. He brought along his mistress, a beautiful woman who became a distraction and a source of resentment among the men. The river journey was grueling. The boats leaked and rotted. Food ran short. The indigenous people deserted whenever they could, slipping away into the jungle. Discipline broke down. Men grumbled openly about turning back, about the futility of the search, about Ursua's incompetence. And Lope de Aguirre listened to this grumbling, and he began to plot. On the first day of January, 1561, while the expedition was camped on an island in the Amazon, Aguirre and a group of conspirators burst into Ursua's tent and murdered him in his bed. It was a brutal killing, multiple stab wounds inflicted in the darkness while Ursua pleaded for his life. The mutineers then seized control of the expedition. They installed a puppet leader, a young nobleman named Fernando de Guzman, whom they proclaimed Prince of Peru and Lord of El Dorado. But everyone understood who really held power. It was Aguirre. What followed was one of the most horrifying episodes in the entire history of exploration. Aguirre declared himself the wrath of God and announced that he was at war not just with indigenous people or rival conquistadors, but with Spain itself, with the king, with the entire established order. He forced every member of the expedition to sign a document renouncing their allegiance to the Spanish crown. Those who refused were killed immediately. Those who showed any sign of wavering were killed. Those who Aguirre simply decided he did not trust were killed. Within weeks, the expedition had descended into a reign of terror. Aguirre murdered Fernando de Guzman when the young nobleman tried to assert his nominal authority. He murdered his own lieutenants when he suspected them of plotting against him. He murdered innocent soldiers for crimes as minor as questioning his orders. The expedition drifted downriver, no longer searching for El Dorado but simply trying to survive. Aguirre's plan, such as it was, seemed to be to reach the Atlantic, then sail to Venezuela or Peru, where he would lead a rebellion against Spanish authority. It was a mad plan, conceived by a mad mind. The men who followed him did so out of fear. To oppose Aguirre was to die. So they rowed and they drifted, and they watched as their companions were murdered one by one for imagined slights or paranoid suspicions. Eventually, after months on the river, the expedition reached the Atlantic coast. They seized a Spanish ship and sailed west along the coast of Guyana and eventually to the island of Margarita off the coast of Venezuela. Aguirre went ashore with his men and immediately began pillaging the island, murdering officials, desecrating churches, and proclaiming his rebellion against the king. But by this time, word of his atrocities had spread. Spanish authorities in the region were preparing to confront him. Aguirre's own men, exhausted and terrified, were beginning to desert. The end came in the city of Valencia, where Aguirre and a handful of loyal followers were surrounded by Spanish troops. Rather than be captured, Aguirre murdered his own daughter, a teenage girl who had accompanied him on the entire journey because he could not bear the thought of her living as the daughter of a traitor. Then he was shot down in the street, like a dog. Before his death, Aguirre wrote a letter to King Philip II of Spain. It was a rambling, bitter document full of grievances and denunciations. He complained about the treatment of conquistadors, about the injustice of the colonial system, about his own failures and frustrations. He signed it, Lope de Aguirre, the Wanderer. The letter was delivered to the king, who read it, and promptly ordered that Aguirre's body be quartered and displayed as a warning to others who might consider rebellion. But Aguirre had already achieved a kind of dark immortality. His story spread throughout the colonies, told and retold, embellished and mythologized. He became a legend, a cautionary tale about the madness that El Dorado could provoke in men. What is remarkable about Aguirre's expedition is that it never seriously searched for El Dorado at all. After the murder of Ursua, the expedition abandoned any pretense of exploration. It became simply a vehicle for Aguirre's madness, a floating hell that drifted downriver, leaving corpses in its wake. And yet, it became forever linked with El Dorado, because it demonstrated so clearly the corrupting influence of the legend, the way the promise of gold could twist men's souls and turn them into monsters. While the Spanish were tearing themselves apart in the jungles of South America, the legend of El Dorado was spreading north, crossing the Atlantic, capturing the imagination of other European powers. None became more obsessed with the Golden City than England, and no Englishman became more obsessed than Sir Walter Raleigh. His story is perhaps the most tragic of all the El Dorado seekers, because he was not a crude conquistador or a fortune hunter, but a cultured gentleman, a poet, a scholar, a favorite of Queen Elizabeth herself. And yet El Dorado destroyed him just as surely as it destroyed Aguirre. Raleigh first heard the stories of El Dorado in the 1580s, when he was already a powerful and wealthy man. He had made his fortune through privateering, through the capture of Spanish ships, through investments in colonial ventures. He had everything a man of his time could want: wealth, titles, the favor of his queen. But it was not enough. He became convinced that somewhere in the interior of Guyana, the territory on the northern coast of South America, there existed a golden city called Manoa, built on the shores of a great lake called Parame. Spanish prisoners and indigenous informants had spoken of it. Maps, crude and unreliable, showed its location. Raleigh studied these maps, read every account of Spanish expeditions he could find, and convinced himself that he could succeed where others had failed. In 1595, he organized his first expedition to Guyana. He sailed with a small fleet of ships and about 100 men, reaching the coast of what is now Venezuela. From there, he planned to travel inland up the Orinoco River, which he believed would lead him to Manoa. The journey was immediately difficult. The Orinoco is one of the great rivers of the world, wide and treacherous, with strong currents and shifting sandbars. The delta was a maze of channels and islands where a man could become lost for weeks. Raleigh and his men transferred to smaller boats and began the journey upstream, rowing against the current in the tropical heat. The landscape was unlike anything Raleigh had seen. The river was bordered by walls of jungle so dense that landing was almost impossible. Caimans basked on mud flats. Clouds of mosquitoes descended on the boats each evening. The men suffered from the heat, from thirst when the river water proved undrinkable, from hunger when their provisions ran low. Raleigh pushed on, questioning every indigenous person he encountered, asking about Manoa, about gold, about the city on the lake. Some told him yes, there was such a place, it was further upstream, just a few more days of travel. Others knew nothing. Still others, sensing what the strange white men wanted to hear, invented elaborate stories about golden temples and streets paved with precious metals. Raleigh traveled up the Orinoco for weeks, penetrating deep into the interior. He saw waterfalls and rapids, mountains rising in the distance, strange rock formations that looked like ancient ruins. But he did not find Manoa. He did not find Lake Parime. He did not find the City of Gold. Eventually, with supplies running critically low and his men on the verge of mutiny, he was forced to turn back. The journey downstream was faster, but no less miserable. When Raleigh finally reached the coast and returned to his ships, he had nothing to show for his efforts except a few samples of ore and a notebook filled with observations and speculations. When he returned to England, Raleigh did something remarkable. Rather than admit failure, he wrote a book about his expedition. It was titled The Discovery of Guyana, and it was published in 1596. In it, Raleigh described the wonders he had seen, the peoples he had encountered, and most importantly, the certainty he felt that Manoa existed. He had not found it. He explained, because he had not traveled far enough, because the season had been wrong, because he had lacked sufficient supplies. But it was there. He was convinced of it. The book was a bestseller, read throughout Europe, translated into multiple languages. It inspired other expeditions, other dreamers, other seekers of gold, and it cemented Raleigh's reputation as an authority on El Dorado, even though he had found nothing. For the next 2 decades, Raleigh tried to organize another expedition, But circumstances conspired against him. Queen Elizabeth died, and her successor, King James I, did not favor Raleigh. He was accused of treason, imprisoned in the Tower of London, and stripped of his titles and estates. He spent 13 years in the Tower, writing, conducting scientific experiments, and dreaming of Guyana. He convinced himself that if he could mount one more expedition, if he could find Manoa and return with its treasures, all would be forgiven. The king would restore his favor, his reputation would be saved. He lobbied incessantly for permission to sail again. Finally, in 1616, King James relented. Raleigh was released from the Tower, on the condition that he would lead an expedition to Guyana and return with gold, but without attacking Spanish territories, as England and Spain were now at peace. It was an impossible condition. The Orinoco region was claimed by Spain. Any search for gold would inevitably bring conflict. But Raleigh was desperate. He agreed to the terms, assembled a fleet, and set sail in 1617. He was now an old man, in his 60s, in poor health, haunted by years of imprisonment. The expedition was doomed from the start. Raleigh himself fell ill with fever almost immediately and was unable to lead the journey up the Orinoco. He sent his son Walter Raleigh the Younger and his lieutenant Lawrence Keymis upriver with a contingent of men. They traveled for weeks, fighting through the jungle, searching for the mine of gold that Raleigh was convinced lay somewhere in the interior. But they found nothing except hostile Spanish outposts. In a skirmish with Spanish soldiers, Raleigh's son was killed. Keymis, devastated and aware that he had failed completely, returned to the coast and committed suicide. When Raleigh heard the news, he was broken. His son was dead. His expedition had failed. He had attacked Spanish territories despite his promise to the king. Raleigh sailed back to England, knowing what awaited him. King James, furious at the violation of his orders and pressured by the Spanish ambassador, ordered Raleigh's arrest. The old sentence of treason was reactivated. On October 29, 1618, Sir Walter Raleigh was beheaded in the old palace yard at Westminster. According to witnesses, he faced his death with courage and dignity, making a short speech in which he maintained his innocence and expressed his faith in God. His last words as he laid his head on the block were reportedly, "Strike, man, strike." The executioner obeyed. Raleigh's story is important because it shows how El Dorado could destroy not just rough soldiers and fortune hunters, but even the most cultured and intelligent men of the age. Raleigh had everything: talent, intelligence, connections, wealth, and he threw it all away, chasing a dream that did not exist.
He died believing, to the very end, that Manoa was real, that Lake Parime existed, that the Golden City was there in the jungle waiting to be found. The tragedy is that he was wrong. Modern geography has mapped every inch of Guyana. There is no Lake Parime. There never was. The lake itself was a myth, born from misunderstood indigenous stories about seasonal flooding in the region. Manoa was a phantom, a mirage created by wishful thinking and cultural misunderstanding. Raleigh died for nothing. Before we continue further into the long litany of failed expeditions, we must pause and ask a question. Why did they believe? Why did intelligent, experienced men continue to chase El Dorado for 300 years, despite the mounting evidence that it did not exist? The answer lies in a complex mixture of psychology, economics, and the peculiar nature of the evidence they possessed. First, we must understand that the conquistadors and explorers were not fools. They had good reasons, or at least reasons that seemed good at the time, for believing in El Dorado. The most important reason was that golden cities had been found before. Tenochtitlan and Cusco were real. The treasures of the Aztecs and Incas were real. When Hernán Cortés entered the Aztec capital, he found a city of perhaps 200,000 people, built on an island in a lake, connected to the mainland by causeways, with temples covered in gold and silver. When Pizarro conquered the Incas, he extracted so much gold and silver that it took months to melt it all down. These were not legends. These were documented historical facts. Ships laden with treasure returned to Spain regularly. The gold was counted, weighed, taxed, and spent. If two great golden civilizations had existed, why not a third? Second, there was real gold in South America. The Muisca worked gold. The Quimbaya made exquisite golden ornaments. The Zenu created elaborate gold jewelry. Dozens of indigenous cultures across the continent mined gold, traded gold, and crafted it into beautiful objects.
Every expedition that entered the interior found some gold, even if it was just ornaments worn by chiefs or offerings in temples. This gold proved that the basic premise was sound. There was gold in the interior, lots of it. The question was not whether gold existed, but where the richest concentration of it could be found. Third, the nature of the evidence was such that it could never be definitively disproven. When an expedition failed to find El Dorado, it did not mean the city did not exist. It simply meant they had looked in the wrong place, or turned back too soon, or taken the wrong route. South America is vast, almost 7 million square miles of mountains, jungles, rivers, and plains. Most of it in the 16th and 17th centuries was completely unmapped. An expedition might travel for months and cover only a tiny fraction of the total territory. The conquistadors understood this. They knew that El Dorado could be just beyond the next mountain range, just up the next tributary, just a few more weeks of travel away. The vastness of the landscape made it impossible to prove the negative. Fourth, there was a powerful economic incentive to believe, particularly for the leaders of expeditions. Organizing an expedition required enormous amounts of capital, money for ships, supplies, weapons, soldiers' wages. This capital often came from investors who expected a return. A leader who returned from an expedition empty-handed had failed his investors and damaged his own reputation. But a leader who returned with nothing but insisted that El Dorado was real, that it was close, that just one more expedition would succeed, that leader could secure funding for another attempt. Belief in El Dorado, in other words, was not just a matter of personal conviction. It was an economic necessity. To admit that the Golden City did not exist was to admit that all the money invested, all the lives lost, all the suffering endured had been for nothing. Fifth, the conquistadors were operating in an environment of profound cultural misunderstanding. When they questioned indigenous people about gold and golden cities, they received answers. But these answers were filtered through layers of translation, misunderstanding, and sometimes deliberate deception. An indigenous person, asked by armed strangers where the gold was, might point in a random direction just to make them go away, or they might describe a distant enemy tribe's wealth, hoping the Spanish would attack them instead. Or they might describe a real place, a chief's village, where gold ornaments were worn during ceremonies which the Spanish would then transform in their imagination into an entire city of gold. The problem was not that indigenous people were lying, but that the Spanish were hearing what they wanted to hear and interpreting ambiguous information in the most optimistic way possible. Sixth, and perhaps most importantly, the search for El Dorado offered something beyond mere wealth. It offered glory, adventure, the chance to be remembered by history. The men who found Tenochtitlan and Cuzco were famous. Their names were known throughout Europe. They had achieved a kind of immortality. Every conquistador who marched into the jungle dreamed of the same thing, that he would be the one to find El Dorado, that his name would be spoken with the same reverence as Cortés and Pizarro, that he would be remembered for centuries. This psychological dimension of the search was just as powerful as the economic one. Men were chasing not just gold, but meaning, purpose, a place in history. Finally, we must consider the role of cognitive bias. Once a person has invested significant time, money, and emotional energy into a belief, it becomes very difficult to abandon that belief, even in the face of contradictory evidence. Psychologists call this the sunk cost fallacy, the tendency to continue investing in something because of what has already been invested, rather than making a rational assessment of future prospects. The conquistadors who spent years searching for El Dorado, who lost friends and fortunes in the pursuit, who suffered incredible hardships, could not easily admit that it had all been for nothing. To maintain their sanity, to preserve their sense of self-worth, they had to believe that El Dorado was real, that their suffering had meaning, that success was still possible. All of these factors combined to create a kind of perfect psychological trap. The evidence was ambiguous enough to support belief. The economic incentives encouraged optimism. The cultural misunderstandings generated a constant stream of new rumors and possibilities. The vastness of the territory made definitive disproof impossible, and the psychological need for meaning made abandoning the search emotionally unbearable. So they kept going. They mounted expedition after expedition, each one convinced that it would be different, that it would succeed where others had failed, and each expedition inevitably returned empty-handed or did not return at all. As the 17th century progressed, The search for El Dorado began to change character. The great era of Spanish conquest was over. The easy territories had been claimed. The major civilizations conquered. The focus shifted from conquest to colonization, from plunder to administration. The Spanish Empire in America became bureaucratic, governed by viceroys and royal officials who were more interested in managing their territories than exploring them. But the legend of El Dorado did not die. Instead, it moved to the margins, pursued by individuals and small expeditions rather than large officially sanctioned forces. One such expedition deserves mention, not because it found anything, but because it demonstrated the enduring power of the legend. In 1775, a Spanish soldier named Nicolás Martínez led a small party into the jungles of eastern Colombia, searching for a lost city he had heard about from indigenous informants. He claimed to have discovered the ruins of an ancient civilization, with stone buildings and golden ornaments scattered on the ground. He returned to Bogotá with samples and stories that sparked enormous excitement. Another expedition was funded, and Martínez led it back into the jungle. But when they reached the place he had described, there was nothing there. No ruins, no gold, nothing but virgin jungle. Martínez was accused of fraud and briefly imprisoned. He insisted until his death that he had really found the ruins, that he simply could not relocate them in the vast green labyrinth. It was a small episode, a footnote to the larger story, but it illustrated how the dream persisted, how men continued to see golden cities in the jungle even when there was nothing to see. The 18th century brought a new kind of explorer to South America, not conquistadors seeking gold, but scientists seeking knowledge. The most famous of these was Alexander von Humboldt, a Prussian naturalist who traveled extensively through the continent from 1799 to 1804. Humboldt was interested in everything: geography, geology, botany, indigenous cultures, climate. He measured temperatures, collected plant specimens, climbed volcanoes, and mapped river systems. He was, in many ways, the opposite of the gold-seeking conquistador. He sought truth, not treasure. And yet even Humboldt could not entirely escape the legend of El Dorado. During his travels, Humboldt investigated the stories of Lake Guatavita and the Golden Man. He interviewed elderly indigenous people who still remembered the old traditions, though the ceremony itself had not been performed in centuries. He examined the lake and correctly identified it as the origin of the El Dorado legend. More importantly, he debunked many of the other myths. He proved, through careful geographical observation, that Lake Paraíba did not exist. He explained how seasonal flooding in the Orinoco Basin had been misinterpreted as a vast permanent lake. He demonstrated that many of the golden cities described in old Spanish accounts were either exaggerations of real indigenous villages or complete fabrications. Humboldt's scientific approach should have ended the legend of El Dorado. His evidence was clear, his methods sound, his conclusions irrefutable, but legends do not die easily, especially when they have taken root in the collective imagination. Even as Humboldt was publishing his findings, others were making new attempts to drain Lake Guatavita and recover its treasures. The first serious attempt had been made as early as 1580, when a Spanish merchant named Antonio de Sepúlveda organized a team of indigenous laborers to cut a notch in the lake's rim, draining the water level by several meters. They did recover some gold figurines, ornaments, a few small plaques, but not nearly enough to justify the effort. The lake was too deep, the mud at the bottom too thick and soft. Men who ventured into the drained portions found themselves sinking into a viscous muck that could not support their weight. Several laborers died in accidents during the attempt. Eventually, the project was abandoned. In 1898, a British company called the Contractors Limited obtained permission from the Colombian government to drain the lake completely. They brought modern equipment, including pumps, tunnels, and engineering expertise. The project was ambitious and expensive. They succeeded in draining the lake almost entirely, exposing the muddy bottom to the sun, but the exposed mud dried and hardened into a cement-like substance that proved impossible to excavate. Worse, when the pumps broke down and had to be replaced, the lake began to refill. The company recovered a few small golden objects, but nothing that came close to covering their costs. The attempt was judged a spectacular failure, and the lake was left to refill naturally. The final major attempt came in 1965, when the Colombian government granted permission to a group of treasure hunters to use more advanced techniques. But by this time, Attitudes toward indigenous heritage sites were beginning to change. Archaeologists and historians protested that Lake Guatavita was an important cultural site that should be preserved, not desecrated for profit. The project was eventually cancelled, and in 1965, the Colombian government declared the lake a protected area. No further attempts to drain it have been permitted. The gold that remains at the bottom of Lake Guatavita, if any still exists, will likely stay there forever. But the story of Lake Guatavita had one final twist. In 1969, two farmers discovered a small cave near Bogotá. Inside, wrapped in reed mats and hidden away centuries ago, was an extraordinary object, a small golden raft about 8 inches long, depicting a ceremony. The raft showed a central figure standing upright, clearly the chief or priest, surrounded by smaller figures in postures of offering or prayer. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the gold pure, the details remarkable. This object, now known as the Muisca raft, is displayed in the Gold Museum in Bogotá, and it is considered one of the most important pre-Columbian artifacts ever found. It is, in a very real sense, El Dorado itself, not a city of gold, but a tiny golden representation of the ceremony that started the legend. It is proof that the stories had a basis in truth, even as it demonstrates the vast gulf between that truth and the fantasies it inspired. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the search for El Dorado gradually transformed from a serious pursuit into a romantic fantasy. Novelists and poets wrote about it. Painters depicted golden cities in jungle settings. The legend became divorced from any real expectation of discovery and became instead a metaphor for impossible dreams, for futile quests, for the human tendency to chase mirages. Edgar Allan Poe wrote a poem titled El Dorado about a knight who spends his life searching for the golden city only to die without finding it. Voltaire's Candide featured El Dorado as a utopian society where gold was so common it was worthless, a satirical comment on European greed. These literary treatments acknowledged the power of the legend while simultaneously mocking those who had believed in it. Yet even in the 20th century, treasure hunters continued to mount expeditions. The Amazon remained largely unexplored. Despite centuries of European presence in South America, the jungle was too vast, too hostile, too difficult to penetrate. Modern technology, airplanes, radios, GPS made exploration easier, but the jungle remained dangerous. And so, every few decades, someone would announce that they had found evidence of a lost city in the Amazon, and the newspapers would run excited stories, and investors would provide funding, and expeditions would set out. They never found El Dorado, but they sometimes found other things: real archaeological sites, forgotten indigenous settlements, evidence of complex pre-Columbian civilizations that had been swallowed by the jungle. These discoveries were fascinating in their own right, but they were not El Dorado. The modern scholarly consensus is clear. El Dorado, as imagined by the conquistadors, a city of gold, a kingdom of unimaginable wealth, never existed. It was a legend born from a real ceremony, amplified by cultural misunderstanding, fed by greed and desperation, and sustained by the vast empty spaces on the map. But this consensus has not entirely killed the dream. Even today, there are people who believe that something remains to be found in the Amazon, some lost city or hidden treasure that has eluded discovery for 500 years. The jungle, they argue, is vast enough to hide anything, and they are not entirely wrong about that. The Amazon is incomprehensibly large, and modern archaeology has revealed that it was far more densely populated in pre-Columbian times than previously believed. Entire civilizations rose and fell in the Amazon, built cities and roads and complex societies, and then disappeared, their works consumed by the jungle within a few generations. So perhaps, they say, perhaps there is still something out there waiting to be found. But even if such a place existed, it would not be El Dorado. It would be an archaeological site, important for what it could teach us about pre-Columbian civilizations, but not a city of gold in any sense that would have satisfied the conquistadors. The gold is gone, melted down centuries ago by Spanish foundries, minted into coins, made into jewelry for European nobles, scattered across the world. What remains in the Amazon, what has always remained, is not treasure but history, not gold but knowledge. And that, perhaps, is more valuable, though it is not the kind of value that would have impressed Pizarro or Aguirre or Raleigh. Now we must turn to the darker side of the legend, the cost that was paid in human lives and human suffering for the pursuit of a dream that did not exist. The search for El Dorado was not a victimless fantasy. It killed thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of people. It destroyed cultures, devastated communities, and left a trail of suffering that echoed across generations. The most obvious victims were the expeditionaries themselves, the Spanish soldiers, the Portuguese explorers, the German mercenaries hired to accompany various expeditions. These men signed on for the promise of wealth, believing that a few months or years of hardship would be rewarded with riches beyond imagination. Most of them died in the jungle, killed by disease, starvation, hostile indigenous people, or simply the brutal conditions of travel in unmapped territory. We know the names of the leaders: Pizarro, Orellana, Quesada, Aguirre, Raleigh, but the names of the common soldiers are lost to history. They are anonymous casualties, remembered only as statistics in the reports sent back to Spain or England. When Pizarro's expedition returned from its search for the land of cinnamon, it had lost more than 90% of its men. When Orellana crossed the Amazon, dozens of his companions died along the way. These were not clean deaths. They were deaths from dysentery, from infected wounds that turned gangrenous in the tropical heat, from starvation so severe that men ate their leather belts and shoes, from attacks by poisoned arrows, from drowning in rapids, from fever that burned through their bodies until they were too weak to stand. But the soldiers were volunteers. They chose to go, even if they did not fully understand the risks. The real victims were the indigenous people and African slaves who were forced to accompany these expeditions as bearers, guides, translators, and laborers. They had no choice. They were conscripted at gunpoint, torn from their villages and families, and forced to march into territories far from their homes, carrying heavy loads, working until they collapsed. The death rate among these forced laborers was even higher than among the Spanish soldiers. Pizarro's expedition to the Amazon began with 4,000 indigenous people. Fewer than a handful survived. They were expendable, considered less valuable than the horses, and when food ran short, they were the first to be left behind to die. Many tried to escape. Those who were caught were killed as examples to the others. Those who succeeded in fleeing often died anyway, lost in unfamiliar jungle too far from home to ever find their way back. The expeditions also had a devastating impact on the indigenous communities they passed through. A Spanish expedition was like a plague, leaving death and destruction in its wake. The soldiers demanded food, and when the local people could not or would not provide it, they took it by force, often leaving entire villages on the brink of starvation. They demanded guides, and when guides were not forthcoming, they took hostages and threatened to kill them. They spread diseases, smallpox, measles, typhus, that devastated indigenous populations with no immunity to European pathogens. An expedition might pass through a region and never return, but the diseases it left behind could wipe out entire villages in the months and years that followed. Worse still was what happened when expeditions found gold, even in small quantities. The discovery of gold in a region brought more expeditions, more conquistadors, more violence. Indigenous communities found themselves subjected to forced labor in mines, working in conditions of appalling brutality. The Spanish encomienda system granted conquistadors the right to demand labor from indigenous people in their territory. In theory, this was supposed to be limited and humane. In practice, it was slavery by another name. Indigenous people were worked to death in gold and silver mines, their labor enriching Spanish overlords, while their own communities collapsed. The regions most affected by the search for El Dorado, the highlands of Colombia, the lowlands of Venezuela, the Amazon basin, saw their indigenous populations decline catastrophically. Some communities disappeared entirely. Others survived but were permanently traumatized, their cultures disrupted, their languages lost, their traditional ways of life destroyed. The environmental impact of the search for El Dorado was also significant, though often overlooked. The mining operations, particularly the attempts to drain Lake Guatavita and other sites believed to contain gold, altered landscapes and water systems. The expeditions themselves carved paths through virgin jungle, cutting down trees, killing animals for food, polluting rivers. These impacts were small compared to the later environmental destruction of the Amazon, but they were the beginning of a process that has not stopped. The search for gold did not end with El Dorado. It continues today, with illegal mining operations destroying rainforest, polluting rivers with mercury, and displacing indigenous communities. The dream of easy wealth extracted from the land has proven to be one of the most durable and destructive legacies of the colonial era. What did the search for El Dorado accomplish? From a purely material standpoint, very little.
Some gold was found, yes.
Quesada's conquest of the Muisca yielded a substantial amount. The various attempts to drain Lake Guatavita recovered a few artifacts, but the total wealth extracted from the search for El Dorado was a tiny fraction of the gold taken from the Aztec and Inca empires, and it was vastly outweighed by the cost of the expeditions themselves. In economic terms, the search for El Dorado was a disaster, a massive misallocation of resources that enriched almost no one and impoverished many. From a geographical and scientific standpoint, the expeditions did contribute to the mapping of South America. Orellana's traverse of the Amazon revealed the existence and course of the world's greatest river. The various expeditions into the interior provided information about the geography of the continent, about its rivers and mountains and jungles. This knowledge was eventually incorporated into maps, making future exploration easier. But this knowledge came at a terrible price, and it could have been acquired through peaceful exploration rather than desperate treasure hunts. From a human standpoint, the search for El Dorado was an unmitigated tragedy. It killed thousands. It destroyed cultures. It inflicted suffering on an almost unimaginable scale. And for what? For a dream, for a legend, for a city that never existed. The conquistadors who marched into the jungle believed they were pursuing glory and wealth. What they actually accomplished was a demonstration of humanity's capacity for self-delusion, cruelty, and waste. And yet the legend endures. El Dorado has entered the collective consciousness, become part of our cultural vocabulary. When we speak of El Dorado today, we are usually speaking metaphorically, referring to any elusive goal, any impossible dream, any treasure that can never quite be grasped. The phrase searching for El Dorado has come to mean pursuing something that does not exist, chasing a mirage, wasting one's life on a fool's errand. It is a cautionary tale, a warning about the dangers of obsession and greed, but it is also something more than that. It is a story about hope, about the human capacity to dream, about the courage or perhaps the foolishness required to venture into the unknown. These two aspects of the legend are inseparable. El Dorado is both an inspiration and a warning, both a dream and a nightmare. The legend has appeared in countless works of literature and art over the centuries. Edgar Allan Poe's poem El Dorado tells the story of a knight who searches his entire life for the Golden City, only to be told by a mysterious shadow as he lies dying that it lies over the mountains of the moon down the valley of the shadow. The implication is clear. El Dorado exists only in death, in the realm beyond life. It is forever out of reach. Voltaire's Candide presents El Dorado as a utopian society hidden in the mountains, where gold and jewels are so common that children use them as toys. When Candide and his companion leave this paradise laden with treasure, they gradually lose all of it through various misfortunes, until they have nothing left. Voltaire's message is satirical but pointed. The pursuit of wealth is futile, and true happiness lies not in gold but in simple, honest labor. In the 20th century, El Dorado became a popular subject for adventure novels and films. These works typically follow a similar formula. A brave explorer, armed with an ancient map or a cryptic clue, ventures into the jungle in search of the lost city. He faces numerous dangers: hostile tribes, treacherous terrain, rival treasure hunters. Often there is a beautiful woman, a daughter of a local guide or a fellow explorer, who accompanies him. In the end, the city is either found, revealing wonders beyond imagination, or it remains lost, suggesting that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. These fictional treatments of El Dorado are entertaining, but they bear little resemblance to the historical reality. They romanticize what was actually a brutal, tragic pursuit. More recently, El Dorado has been used as a metaphor in economics and politics. A politician might promise an El Dorado of prosperity, implying wealth without effort. An economist might warn against El Dorado thinking, the belief that there are easy solutions to complex problems. The term has become shorthand for any scheme that promises too much and delivers too little. It is a useful metaphor precisely because the historical El Dorado was such a perfect example of how hope can blind people to reality, how the promise of reward can lead people to accept massive risks and costs. In Latin America, particularly in Colombia, The legend of El Dorado has a complex cultural significance. On one hand, it is a source of national identity, a connection to the pre-Columbian past. The Muisca raft, that small golden artifact depicting the ceremony at Lake Guatavita, is one of the most iconic symbols of Colombian heritage, displayed prominently in the Gold Museum in Bogotá. School children learn about the Golden Man and the lake ceremony as part of their history curriculum. It is a story that Colombians can take pride in, a demonstration of the sophistication and artistry of their indigenous ancestors. On the other hand, the legend is also a reminder of the colonial period, of the violence and exploitation that followed the arrival of the Spanish. The same story that speaks of indigenous craftsmanship and religious practice also speaks of conquest, plunder, and cultural destruction. This dual nature makes El Dorado a complicated symbol, one that evokes both pride and pain. Modern Colombian scholars and artists have grappled with this complexity, creating works that examine the legend from indigenous perspectives, that question the European narratives, that seek to reclaim the story from the conquistadors who appropriated it. In the realm of archaeology, El Dorado has had a profound impact on how we understand pre-Columbian South America. For centuries, European scholars dismissed indigenous South American civilizations as primitive, simple societies incapable of great achievements. The search for El Dorado, ironically, helped to challenge this view. As expeditions explored the interior and archaeologists began to study the artifacts and ruins they found, it became clear that the indigenous peoples of South America had built sophisticated societies with complex social structures, advanced agricultural techniques, and remarkable artistic traditions. The Muisca, far from being simple savages, were skilled metallurgists who had developed techniques for working gold and other metals that European craftsmen could not replicate. The cultures of the Amazon, once thought to be small nomadic groups, are now known to have included large settled populations that managed the forest environment in sophisticated ways, cultivating crops, building earthworks, and creating terra preta, a type of enriched soil that remains fertile to this day. The legend of El Dorado, in its own perverse way, drove exploration and research that ultimately revealed the richness of pre-Columbian South American cultures. Of course, this knowledge came at a terrible cost. Many artifacts were destroyed before they could be studied. Many sites were looted for their gold content. With the archaeological context, the information about who made these objects, when and why, lost forever. But the fragments that survived, the sites that were eventually excavated scientifically rather than plundered, have given us a window into worlds that would otherwise have remained unknown. One of the most important recent discoveries related to the El Dorado legend is the finding that Lake Guatavita was not unique. Archaeologists have discovered that the Muisca performed similar ceremonies at multiple lakes in the highlands of Colombia. Offerings of gold and emeralds have been found in Lake Sicha, Lake Fucane, and several other sites. This suggests that the ceremony witnessed by Spanish conquistadors was part of a widespread religious practice, not an isolated event. It also suggests that the indigenous accounts of a golden man that the Spanish heard were not exaggerations or lies but accurate descriptions of a real and important aspect of Muisca's spiritual life. The tragedy is that the Spanish, in their greed, could not see the ceremony for what it was, a profound religious act, a connection between a people and their sacred landscape. They saw only the gold, and in seeing only the gold, they missed the true meaning of what they were witnessing. Modern indigenous communities in Colombia have a complex relationship with the El Dorado legend. For some, it is a source of pride, proof that their ancestors had wealth and sophistication that impressed even the rapacious Spanish. For others, it is a painful reminder of what was lost, of treasures stolen, of a way of life destroyed. There have been efforts in recent decades to reclaim the narrative, to tell the story of El Dorado from an indigenous perspective. These retellings emphasize the spiritual significance of the gold ceremony, the connection to the lake and the mountains, the communal nature of the offering. They present the golden man not as a source of plunder, but as a religious leader performing a sacred duty, giving back to the earth what the earth had provided. There have also been efforts to repatriate artifacts taken during the colonial period. The Gold Museum in Bogotá houses the largest collection of pre-Columbian gold artifacts in the world, with over 55,000 pieces. This collection includes items that were purchased, donated, or seized from illegal treasure hunters over the years. It is a magnificent collection, beautifully displayed, offering visitors a glimpse of the artistic achievements of the Muisca, Quimbaya, Kalima, Zenu, and other indigenous cultures. But it also raises difficult questions. How many of these artifacts were obtained under dubious circumstances? How many should be in the hands of indigenous communities rather than in a state museum? These are questions without easy answers, but they are being asked with increasing urgency as attitudes toward indigenous rights and cultural patrimony continue to evolve. The El Dorado legend has also influenced modern treasure hunting and archaeological looting. Even today, there are individuals who venture into the jungles and mountains of South America with metal detectors and digging equipment, searching for pre-Columbian gold. This modern treasure hunting is illegal in most South American countries, as laws have been passed to protect archaeological sites and prevent the unauthorized removal of artifacts. But the laws are difficult to enforce in remote areas, and the financial incentives for treasure hunting remain strong. A single pre-Columbian gold figurine can sell for tens of thousands of dollars on the black market. Larger pieces, particularly those with clear provenance or artistic merit, can command prices in the millions. This has created a thriving illegal trade in pre-Columbian artifacts, with looters destroying archaeological sites to extract saleable items, and smugglers moving these items to collectors in Europe, North America, and Asia. The damage caused by this modern looting is incalculable. Every artifact removed from its archaeological context loses most of its scientific value. Archaeologists cannot determine when it was made, who made it, what it was used for, or how it relates to other artifacts without this context. The information that could be gleaned from a proper scientific excavation, information about ancient societies, their beliefs, their technologies, their ways of life, is lost forever. In this sense, the search for El Dorado continues, not as organized expeditions, but as a slow, steady destruction of South America's archaeological heritage by individuals motivated by the same greed that motivated the conquistadors. Governments and international organizations have tried to combat this looting through various means. UNESCO conventions require signatory nations to prevent the illegal export of cultural artifacts and to assist in their repatriation when they are discovered abroad. Many museums have adopted policies requiring rigorous provenance research before acquiring pre-Columbian artifacts, refusing to purchase items that may have been illegally excavated or exported. Law enforcement agencies in several countries have created specialized units to investigate artifact smuggling. These efforts have had some success. Numerous looted artifacts have been seized and returned to their countries of origin. Some prominent collectors and dealers have been prosecuted. But the illegal trade continues, driven by the enormous prices that pre-Columbian gold commands and by the vast, difficult-to-police territories where archaeological sites are located. The story of El Dorado, then, is not just a historical tale. It is an ongoing story, one that continues to shape how we think about wealth, ambition, cultural heritage, and the relationship between past and present. The conquistadors who searched for the Golden City are long dead, but their legacy persists in multiple forms. It persists in the maps they created, which despite their inaccuracies laid the foundation for modern cartography of South America. It persists in the Spanish language and Catholic religion that dominate much of the continent, brought by the same men who sought El Dorado. It persists in the mixed-race populations of Colombia, Venezuela, and other countries, descendants of Spanish soldiers and indigenous people. It persists in the poverty and inequality that still plague much of Latin America, rooted in colonial economic systems that prioritized the extraction of wealth over the development of sustainable local economies. But the legacy also persists in more positive forms. It persists in the resilience of indigenous communities that survived the conquest and maintained their cultural identities despite centuries of oppression. It persists in the rich archaeological record that, when studied properly, reveals the complexity and sophistication of pre-Columbian societies. It persists in the museums and universities of South America, where scholars work to understand and preserve their continent's heritage. And it persists in the cultural production of Latin American writers, artists, and filmmakers who have taken the El Dorado legend and transformed it, using it to explore themes of identity, colonialism, resistance, and hope. One of the most powerful artistic treatments of the El Dorado theme is the novel The General in His Labyrinth by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. While not directly about El Dorado, The novel deals with Simón Bolívar's final journey down the Magdalena River, the same river that Quesada traveled up centuries earlier in his search for gold. Márquez uses the river journey as a meditation on the cost of ambition, the gap between dreams and reality, and the way historical figures are remembered. Bolívar, like the seekers of El Dorado, was chasing a dream, in his case, the dream of a united, independent South America. Like them, he failed to achieve that dream completely. Like them, his story became legend, transformed and mythologized by later generations. The parallels between Bolívar's quest for political freedom and the conquistadors' quest for gold are deliberate. Both were driven by powerful visions of what could be. Both paid enormous personal costs. Both left complicated legacies that South Americans are still working to understand. Another important work is The Vortex by José Eustacio Rivera, a novel set in the Colombian Amazon during the rubber boom of the early 20th century. The novel's protagonist ventures into the jungle in pursuit of wealth, only to be consumed by the jungle's violence and chaos. While the novel is not explicitly about El Dorado, its themes, the destructive nature of greed, the power of the jungle, the impossibility of civilizing or controlling the natural world, are clearly descended from the El Dorado legend. Rivera's jungle is a place where human ambition goes to die, where the dreams of wealth and success are swallowed by green darkness. It is a powerful reminder that the search for El Dorado was at its core a story about human limits, about the futility of trying to impose human will on a landscape that does not recognize human authority. In cinema, Werner Herzog's films Aguirre, The Wrath of God and Fitzcarraldo both draw heavily on El Dorado themes. Aguirre directly depicts the historical Lope de Aguirre's mad expedition down the Amazon. Herzog's portrayal is hallucinatory and nightmarish, emphasizing the descent into madness, the breakdown of European order in the face of the jungle's immensity. The film's final image, Aguirre standing alone on a raft covered in dead bodies, delivering a deranged speech about conquering kingdoms that do not exist, is perhaps the most powerful cinematic statement ever made about the insanity of the El Dorado quest. Fitzcarraldo, while set in a later period, tells a similar story of a European who ventures into the Amazon with an impossible dream, in this case to build an opera house in the jungle. The protagonist's obsession mirrors that of the conquistadors, and like them, he achieves a kind of success, but at a cost that makes the achievement hollow. These artistic works, and many others like them, demonstrate that El Dorado has transcended its origins as a specific historical legend and become a universal symbol. It represents the human tendency to pursue impossible dreams, to convince ourselves that happiness or fulfillment lies just beyond the next horizon. It represents the danger of obsession, the way a single-minded pursuit of a goal can blind us to the costs we are paying and the harm we are inflicting. It represents the tension between ambition and wisdom, between the desire to achieve something great and the recognition that some things are not meant to be achieved. These are timeless themes, relevant in every age, which is why the El Dorado legend continues to resonate centuries after the expeditions ended. In the years since the conquest, indigenous communities across Colombia and Venezuela have worked to preserve and reclaim their heritage from the shadow of the El Dorado legend. This work has not been easy. For centuries, indigenous voices were silenced, their stories dismissed or ignored by the dominant European-descended culture. The narrative of El Dorado, as it has been told in history books and popular culture, has primarily been a European narrative, focused on the conquistadors and explorers rather than on the people whose lands they invaded and whose cultures they destroyed. Only recently has there been a concerted effort to center indigenous perspectives, to tell the story of what happened from the point of view of those who lived through it and their descendants. This effort has taken many forms. Indigenous historians and scholars have published books and articles that re-examine the conquest period from indigenous viewpoints, drawing on oral histories, archaeological evidence, and careful reinterpretation of colonial-era documents. These scholars have shown that the indigenous response to the Spanish invasion was more complex and varied than the simple narrative of conquest suggests. There was resistance, fierce, organized resistance in many cases. There were strategic alliances, attempts to play different European powers against each other, efforts to preserve autonomy while adapting to new realities. There was also profound trauma, loss, and suffering on a scale that is difficult for those who have not experienced colonization to fully comprehend. Indigenous artists have also contributed to this reclamation project. Painters, sculptors, writers, and performers have created works that explore the El Dorado legend from indigenous perspectives, often subverting or challenging the traditional European narratives. These works present the Golden Man not as a source of treasure for outsiders to plunder, but as a spiritual leader fulfilling a sacred duty. They present Lake Guatavita not as a repository of wealth, but as a sacred site, a place where the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds grew thin. They present the Muisca people not as victims or as obstacles to European ambition, but as sophisticated, resilient people with their own complex history and culture. The Colombian government has also played a role in this process of reclamation and preservation. The Gold Museum in Bogotá, which houses the world's largest collection of pre-Columbian gold artifacts, has been redesigned in recent years to emphasize the cultural and spiritual significance of these objects rather than their monetary value. The museum's exhibits explain the meaning of the objects, the techniques used to create them, the beliefs they represented. They place gold work in the context of broader indigenous cultures, showing how metallurgy was just one aspect of sophisticated societies that also developed agriculture, architecture, astronomy, and social organization. The museum has become in effect a monument to what was lost during the conquest, not just gold but entire ways of life, systems of knowledge, artistic traditions. Outside the museum, in the streets and markets of Colombian cities, you can see the continuing influence of indigenous heritage. Traditional crafts are still produced and sold: woven textiles, pottery, small metal objects. Some of these are made by indigenous artisans, using traditional techniques passed down through generations. Others are modern interpretations, created by non-indigenous artists inspired by pre-Columbian designs. This blending of old and new, indigenous and European, reflects the complex reality of modern Colombia, a country still working to come to terms with its colonial past and to forge an identity that honors all aspects of its heritage. For the Muisca people specifically, the situation is complicated. Unlike some indigenous groups in Colombia who have maintained relatively distinct cultural identities, the Muisca were largely assimilated into the colonial society that developed after the conquest. Their language, Chibcha, is extinct, with no native speakers remaining. Their traditional social structures were disrupted and eventually destroyed. Many Muisca descendants are not even aware of their indigenous heritage, having been absorbed into the broader mestizo population. However, in recent decades, there has been a Muisca revival movement, with people claiming Muisca identity and working to reconstruct aspects of their culture from historical records, archaeological evidence, and the practices of related indigenous groups. This revival is controversial. Some scholars and other indigenous groups question whether a culture that has been so thoroughly disrupted can truly be revived, or whether what is being created is something new that merely borrows elements from the past. But for those involved in the revival, these questions are less important than the act of reclaiming an identity and honoring ancestors. The debate over indigenous identity and cultural authenticity is part of a larger conversation happening across Latin America about what it means to be indigenous in the modern world. Is indigenous identity defined by blood quantum, by cultural practice, by self-identification, by community recognition? How do indigenous people balance the preservation of traditional ways of life with the need and desire to participate in modern economies and societies? How do they maintain cultural distinctiveness while also asserting their rights as full citizens of modern nation-states? These questions do not have simple answers, and different individuals and communities answer them in different ways. But the fact that these conversations are happening, that indigenous voices are being heard and taken seriously, represents a significant change from the centuries when indigenous perspectives were ignored or suppressed. The El Dorado legend in this context has become a focal point for discussions about colonialism, cultural appropriation, and historical memory. Some indigenous activists argue that the legend should be rejected entirely, dismissed as a European fantasy that has nothing to do with authentic Muisca culture. Others argue that the legend, despite its European origins, has become so entangled with Muisca identity that it cannot be simply discarded. Still others seek a middle path, acknowledging the legend while insisting on telling it in a way that centers the Muisca ceremony and its spiritual significance rather than the Spanish quest for gold. These debates are not merely academic. They have real implications for how indigenous heritage is preserved, how tourism to sites like Lake Guatavita is managed, how museums present pre-Columbian artifacts, and how Colombian society as a whole understands its history. In the end, the El Dorado legend, like all legends, belongs to no one and to everyone. It has been told and retold so many times, in so many different ways, by so many different people, that no single telling can claim to be definitive. The Muisca ceremony at Lake Guatavita was a historical reality. The Spanish search for the City of Gold was also a historical reality. Both are part of the story, and both deserve to be told truthfully and completely. The challenge is to tell the story in a way that acknowledges all perspectives, that recognizes both the beauty of the original ceremony and the tragedy of what followed, that honors indigenous culture while also examining the European response to it, that neither romanticizes the past nor reduces it to simple narratives of victimization and oppression. This is difficult work, requiring careful thought, genuine dialogue, and a willingness to sit with complexity and ambiguity. It requires that we resist the temptation to make the story simple, to draw easy moral lessons, to divide people into categories of good and evil. The conquistadors who searched for El Dorado were not simple villains. They were complex human beings, products of their time and culture, capable of both remarkable achievements and terrible cruelties. The indigenous people they encountered were not simple victims. They were diverse, with their own cultures, conflicts, and choices. The story of El Dorado is a story about the collision of worlds, about misunderstanding and greed and violence, but also about human resilience, cultural adaptation, and the enduring power of memory. And now, as we approach the end of our journey through this legend, let us return one more time to where we began, to Lake Guatavita, to the ceremony that started it all. Imagine that you are standing once again on the shore of that perfectly circular lake high in the Colombian Andes. But this time, you are not standing in the 16th century, watching the Golden Man perform his ceremony. You are standing in the present day, in the 21st century. The lake is quiet, protected now by Colombian law, off limits to treasure hunters and development. The surrounding mountains are green with vegetation, the same mountains that have watched over this lake for thousands of years. The indigenous people who once performed ceremonies here are gone, their descendants scattered or assimilated into modern Colombian society. The gold that once lay at the bottom of the lake has been partially recovered, partially remains, and partially was lost to the various attempts to drain the water. The lake itself is smaller than it once was, its rim scarred by the notch cut in 1580, but it endures. You are not alone at the lake. There are other visitors, tourists from Bogotá perhaps, or international travelers, who have read about the legend and wanted to see the place that inspired it. There is a small visitors center where guides explain the history and the ceremony, where photographs and diagrams help visitors understand what once happened here. There are paths and viewpoints carefully maintained to minimize environmental impact. It is a managed site, a historical monument, a protected heritage area. It is not the wild, sacred place it once was, but something of that sacredness remains. Something in the stillness of the water, the whisper of wind through the reeds, the way the sunlight moves across the lake's surface. What do you feel, standing there? Perhaps a sense of loss, mourning for the indigenous culture that was destroyed, for the gold that was taken, for the lives that were spent in the search for this place. Perhaps a sense of awe, at the beauty of the landscape, at the audacity of the ceremony, at the fact that something as simple as a religious ritual could spark centuries of obsession and violence. Perhaps a sense of irony, that what the conquistadors sought so desperately, a city of gold, unimaginable wealth, was never here at all, that they misunderstood everything they heard, that they chased a phantom of their own creation. Perhaps a sense of sadness, that human beings are capable of such magnificent dreams and such terrible actions, often at the same time. Or perhaps you feel something simpler and more profound, a connection to the past, a sense that the people who stood on this shore centuries ago were not so different from you. They loved and feared, they hoped and dreamed. They created beautiful things and believed in forces larger than themselves. They were human, in all the complexity that the word implies, and the conquistadors who came searching for them were human too, driven by greed and ambition, but also by courage and curiosity, capable of terrible cruelty, but also of incredible endurance. To understand the El Dorado legend is to understand something fundamental about human nature, about our capacity for both transcendence and self-destruction. The city of gold that the conquistadors sought did not exist. But in a sense, it exists now, in a different form. It exists in the Gold Museum in Bogotá, where thousands of pre-Columbian gold artifacts are preserved and displayed, offering visitors a glimpse of the artistic and spiritual world of the indigenous peoples who created them. It exists in the archaeological sites scattered across Colombia, Venezuela, and other South American countries, where researchers continue to uncover evidence of sophisticated pre-Columbian civilizations. It exists in the stories and memories of indigenous communities who have maintained their cultural identities despite centuries of oppression. It exists in the books and films and works of art that have taken the legend and transformed it into something new, something meaningful for contemporary audiences. Most of all, it exists in our imaginations, as a symbol of the human condition. We are all in our own ways, searching for El Dorado. We are all pursuing something that we believe will make us happy, fulfilled, successful, complete. For some, it is wealth. For others, it is fame, or love, or knowledge, or spiritual enlightenment. The specific object of our search varies, but the search itself is universal. We spend our lives convinced that happiness is just beyond our current reach, that if we could just achieve this one thing, acquire this one possession, reach this one milestone, then we would be satisfied. Unlike the conquistadors, we often find that when we achieve our goals, they do not bring the satisfaction we expected. The city of gold, when we finally reach it, turns out to be just another place, just another thing, unable to fulfill the immense weight of our expectations. This is not to say that ambition is foolish or that goals are meaningless. Human achievement is real and valuable. The explorers who searched for El Dorado did map the Amazon, did discover new lands, did expand the boundaries of geographical knowledge. These achievements mattered, even if they came at a terrible cost. Similarly, our personal ambitions and goals, even if they do not bring ultimate fulfillment, can still enrich our lives and drive us to become better versions of ourselves. The danger comes not from having dreams, but from allowing those dreams to blind us to everything else, to the harm we might be causing, to the beauty of the present moment, to the value of what we already have. The conquistadors who searched for El Dorado made this mistake. They were so focused on the city of gold that they could not see the actual riches around them, the incredible biodiversity of the Amazon, the sophisticated cultures of the indigenous peoples, the beauty of the landscape itself. They could not appreciate these things, because they were not what they were looking for. They wanted gold, and anything that was not gold was merely an obstacle to be overcome. In their single-minded pursuit, they destroyed much of what made the regions they explored valuable in the first place. We are capable of making the same mistake in our own lives. We can become so focused on our goals, career success, financial security, social status, that we fail to appreciate the moments of beauty and connection that make life worth living. We can sacrifice relationships, health, integrity in pursuit of achievements that ultimately matter less than we thought they would. The lesson of El Dorado is not that we should abandon our dreams, but that we should hold them lightly, with awareness of their limitations and costs. We should pursue our goals with passion, but also with wisdom, with ambition, but also with compassion, with determination, but also with the willingness to step back and ask ourselves whether what we are pursuing is truly worth the price we are paying. There is another lesson in the El Dorado story, one that is particularly relevant in our own time. The conquistadors believed that wealth and happiness could be taken from others, that the gold they sought belonged to whoever had the power to claim it. This belief justified enormous violence and exploitation. They saw indigenous peoples not as fellow human beings with their own rights and desires, but as obstacles or tools to be removed or used as needed. This attitude that the world and its resources exist to be exploited by those with the power to do so has had devastating consequences that extend far beyond the search for El Dorado. It is the same attitude that justified centuries of colonialism, slavery, and environmental destruction. It is an attitude that continues to shape our world, influencing how we think about natural resources, about development, about the rights of indigenous peoples and other marginalized communities. The antidote to this attitude is respect for other people, for other cultures, for the natural world. It is the recognition that wealth and happiness cannot be taken without consequence, that true fulfillment comes not from exploitation but from connection, from understanding, from learning to live in balance with the world around us. The indigenous people who performed the ceremony at Lake Guatavita understood this. They gave their gold back to the earth, recognizing that what they took from the earth must ultimately be returned. It was a ritual of reciprocity, of balance, of acknowledgement that human beings are part of a larger system that must be maintained. The conquistadors, in their greed, could not understand this. They saw only the gold, only what they could take, never what they owed. As we lie here in the darkness, preparing for sleep, let us carry this lesson with us. Let us remember that the most valuable things in life, love, friendship, beauty, meaning, cannot be taken by force. They can only be received, cultivated, nurtured. Let us remember that happiness is not a city waiting to be discovered, but a way of being in the world, a practice of gratitude and awareness. Let us remember that the true treasures are not hidden in distant jungles, but present in our daily lives, if only we have the wisdom to recognize them. The search for El Dorado ended centuries ago. The expeditions stopped, the conquistadors died. The dream faded, replaced by more realistic assessments of what South America contained, but in another sense, the search never ended. Every generation has its own El Dorado, its own impossible dream, its own distant goal that seems to promise ultimate fulfillment. And every generation must learn, as the conquistadors learned too late, that the pursuit of these dreams must be tempered with wisdom, with compassion, with awareness of the costs and consequences. Lake Guatavita still exists, high in the Colombian mountains. The gold that remains at its bottom will likely stay there forever, protected by law and by the simple recognition that some things are more valuable left undisturbed than recovered. The lake has become a symbol no longer of wealth to be plundered, but of heritage to be preserved, of the need to protect and honor the past rather than exploit it. It stands as a quiet rebuke to the conquistadors who tried to drain it, a reminder that not everything can or should be taken, that some mysteries are meant to remain mysteries, that the true value of a place lies not in what can be extracted from it, but in what it represents and what it teaches us. As you drift towards sleep, imagine that you are floating on that lake, carried by gentle currents, surrounded by mountains and sky. The water is cool and dark beneath you. Above, stars are beginning to appear in the deepening twilight. There is no sound except the whisper of wind and the distant call of birds settling for the night. You are not searching for anything. You are not pursuing any goal. You are simply present, in this moment, in this place, at peace with the world and with yourself. This, perhaps, is the true El Dorado. Not a city of gold, but a state of being, a moment of perfect stillness and contentment. It cannot be found through exploration or conquest. It can only be discovered within ourselves, in the quiet spaces between our thoughts, in the acceptance of what is rather than the pursuit of what might be. The conquistadors never found this peace. They died searching, driven by dreams that could never be fulfilled. But we can learn from their failure. We can choose a different path. We can recognize that the journey matters more than the destination, that the process of searching teaches us more than the discovery ever could, that wisdom lies not in achieving our goals but in understanding why we sought them in the first place, and what we were really looking for all along. And so, dear listener, our story comes to an end. We have journeyed through centuries, across continents, into the hearts of jungles and the depths of human ambition. We have witnessed courage and cruelty, brilliance and madness, triumph and tragedy. We have seen how a simple ceremony at a mountain lake became a legend that shaped the history of a continent. We have learned that the city of gold was a mirage, a phantom created by misunderstanding and amplified by greed. But we have also learned that legends, even false ones, have power. They shape how we see the world and ourselves. They drive us to action, for good or ill. They persist in our collective memory, teaching us lessons about who we are and who we might become. The city of gold does not exist. It never existed. But the search for it revealed truths about human nature that remain valid today. It showed us the dangers of obsession, the cost of greed, the ease with which we can deceive ourselves about what we truly need and want. It showed us that happiness cannot be found in distant lands or in material wealth, that fulfillment comes not from taking but from giving, not from conquest but from connection. As you close your eyes and allow sleep to claim you, let the story of El Dorado fade into the background of your consciousness. Let it become a dream, joining all the other dreams that visit us in the night. And perhaps in that liminal space between waking and sleeping, you will understand what the conquistadors never could, that the true treasure was never the gold they sought, but the world they traveled through, the people they encountered, the experiences they had. The journey was the treasure. The search itself was the discovery. Everything they needed was already present. They were simply too blind with ambition to see it. Sleep now. Dream of golden cities if you must, but know that when you wake, the real treasures will be waiting. The sunlight through your window, the breath in your lungs, the possibilities of a new day. These are the true riches, more valuable than all the gold in all the lakes of all the mountains in the world. This is the lesson of El Dorado. This is the wisdom bought at such a terrible price. This is what remains when the legend fades and only truth endures. Thank you for joining me on this journey through history and legend. Our story of El Dorado has reached its end, but the lessons it teaches continue. Until we meet again, I wish you peaceful dreams, restful sleep, and the wisdom to recognize the treasures that already surround you. Good night, and may your own searches, whatever they may be guided by wisdom, tempered with compassion, and lead you not to distant golden cities, but to the peace and fulfillment that were always from the very beginning within your reach. Sleep well, dear listener, and dream of the quiet lake in the mountains, where the golden man once walked into the water, washed away his glory, and emerged simply as himself. That is the final image I leave you with, not a city of gold, but a man made golden, returning to humanity. That is the true story of El Dorado. That is where the legend began and where now our telling of it ends. Good night.